I don't usually do episodes about bands, and if this were just a band story, I wouldn't be doing this one. Because band histories are safe now. They're nostalgia products, boxed, labeled, sold back to you with the sharp edges all filed down, so nobody gets uncomfortable. This isn't that. This is about a group of people who understood something most protest movements never do. Power doesn't collapse when you oppose it. It collapses when you impersonate it well enough that nobody can tell the difference. This is about Crass. And it's not a music story. It's a case study in how authority actually works and how fragile it is when you stop playing along. But before we go deeper, like, subscribe, don't be a poser. In the early 80s, Crass anonymously released a cassette that appeared to contain leaked phone calls between Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan. In the recording, Thatcher calmly discusses allowing British sailors to die during the Falklands War because the political optics would justify it. The tone is casual, managerial, and cold. The tapes were fake, but the reaction wasn't. Before the government could contain it, the recordings were circulated through activist networks, press offices, and intelligence channels. Scotland Yard investigated. MI5 investigated. Parliament had to issue statements. The British state was forced to publicly reassure its citizens that it had not been exposed by an anarchist punk collective operating out of a decaying farmhouse. That moment matters because Crass didn't hack anything. They didn't steal classified material. They didn't break into a building. They simply understood how power sounds and reproduced it convincingly enough to cause panic. That's not protest. It's more like cultural anthropology with teeth. Crass didn't confront authority head on. They mirrored it. And mirrors are dangerous things. To understand why Crass did this and why it worked, you have to understand the environment that came out of it. The late 70s, Britain wasn't rebellious in a romantic way. It was collapsing in slow motion. Industry was dying. Unemployment was brutal. The future wasn't something you planned for. It was something you tried to avoid being crushed by. This wasn't about teenage rebellion. It was about survival inside a system that no longer pretended to care. Crass formed around Dial House, a communal living space that wasn't meant to be symbolic. It was functional. People lived there because they couldn't or wouldn't live the way society demanded. That distinction matters. It wasn't cosplay, it was withdrawal. And withdrawal is the one thing the system doesn't know how to handle. You can protest and still participate. You can rebel and still consume. You can criticize and still comply. But when people stop participating entirely, the system loses leverage. And Crass understood that. So they didn't build a band in the traditional sense. They built a distribution network. Records were pressed independently. Art was deliberately abrasive, strange collages that looked like classified documents ripped up and taped back together and wrong. Lyrics weren't catchy. They were confrontational, accusatory, exhausting. This wasn't meant to entertain you. It was meant to implicate you. They refused frontmen, refused hierarchy, refused branding before branding was even a word. The absence of a single leader wasn't aesthetic, it was strategic. You can't assassinate a symbol if there isn't one. And more importantly, they didn't want fans. Fans consume. Participants act. Crass wanted people who would copy tapes, photocopy pamphlets, spread material by hand. Slow networks, human networks. The kind that doesn't scale but also don't collapse when a platform changes the rules. This is where it connects to me personally, and why it isn't really that abstract. In 1989, I was 14 years old in Connecticut. Small town, clean sidewalk, couple strip malls, schools that trained you to sit still and wait for a future that felt like a corporate orientation video. I skated, I listened to punk. I felt like the world had already been decided somewhere else by people I would never meet. From where I stood, crust punks and squatters didn't look like losers. They looked like escape artists. They lived in abandoned buildings, rode freight trains, refused jobs, refused authority, and refused to explain themselves. To a 14-year-old kid trapped in suburban Connecticut, that didn't look reckless. It looked like freedom with consequences, and somehow that made it feel more real. Crass fed that image, but not like in a romantic way. They didn't make squatting look easy or heroic. They made it look harsh, unstable, uncomfortable. And that honestly mattered because they weren't selling an image. They were documenting a refusal. What they were really attacking wasn't capitalism in the abstract. It was obedience. The quiet agreement to play a role you didn't choose in exchange for comfort you didn't fully trust. The Thatchergate tapes, they weren't a prank. They were a demonstration. They showed that authority isn't held together by truth. It's held together by performance, tone, confidence, and familiar language. And once you see that, the whole thing starts to wobble. Crass kept pushing that idea through anti-war messaging, through anti-nationalist imagery, through relentless exposure of hypocrisy. They treated patriotism not as identity, but as theater. And they showed how easily the script could be rewritten by anyone who understood it. The state did notice. Not because Crass was violent, but because they were uncontrollable. You can negotiate with leaders, you can co-opt movements, you can offer reforms. You can't negotiate with people who don't want what you're offering. And that's where the fantasy, the one I had as a kid, starts to crack. Because living outside the system isn't glamorous. It's cold, it's unstable, it demands constant sacrifice. Dial House wasn't a utopia. It was hard work, interpersonal conflict, exhaustion, compromise without comfort. Crass never pretended otherwise, and eventually they did something almost unheard of. They ended it all themselves. They disbanded deliberately, before success could hollow them out, before they became examples instead of signals, before refusal turned into product. That decision is the most radical thing they ever did. Because modern culture teaches you to cling, to stay relevant, to grow, to optimize and monetize. Crass chose disappearance instead. So that's why they're so hard to talk about now. You can't turn that into a brand. You can't revive it without betraying it. You can't scale refusal. And maybe that's the point. Looking back, I don't romanticize squatting in the idealistic way I did at 14. I understand why most people don't choose it. I understand why many who tried couldn't sustain it. But I also understand why it mattered that people did. Crass proved that culture doesn't have to ask permission, that authority can be mimicked, mocked, and destabilized without ever touching a weapon. That participation is a choice, not an obligation. And maybe most importantly, they proved that some ideas are meant to exist briefly, burn hot, and then disappear, leaving behind questions instead of institutions. That's not a band story. That's a warning. Because today, everything gets absorbed, even rebellion, even dissent, even anti-capitalism. Everything becomes content. Everything becomes merch. Everything becomes safe. Crass existed before that absorption was complete. They slipped through cracks that have since been sealed. And for a kid skating crumbling pavement in Connecticut in 1989, those cracks meant everything. Not because they offered a map out, but because they proved that the map was incomplete. And once you're aware of that, you don't see through the world the same way again. That's why this episode exists, not to celebrate a band, but to document a moment when refusal was real and power noticed. Again, not a band biography. More like anthropology? Anyway, there are lessons to be learned here, and that's why this story still matters. Thanks again. This has been Slack Signal X.